As many of you may be aware, the world is going to war. I don't know when it's going to happen. Nobody knows exactly when it's going to happen, but the world is going to war, right? It's unmistakable. All the signs are there. And in that coming war, it's going to be a war which is information first and digital first. That's the world that we're going into. So if you're going into that world and you don't have any means of projecting your own viewpoints, your own perspectives, your own existence onto the world, and you're waiting for one foreign CSO or one BBC, one Voice of America to speak for you, I'm sorry. That's not going to end well for all of us, myself included.
In the Nigerian 2023 presidential elections, there were three leading candidates. The first person is the person who is our president today, candidate Bola Tinubu then. And then we had Alhaji Atiku Abubakar of the PDP, and then we have Peter Obi of the Labour Party. Those of us who followed the contest very closely also realized that there was one gentleman who distinguished himself in the whole contest. He was a supporter of the Labour Party, even though he was not necessarily a supporter of the Labour Party. He was also supporting the PDP, but he was quite antagonistic to Bola Tinubu. This gentleman's name is David Hundeyin. Yesterday, I learned from a video that David Hundeyin published on YouTube that he has retired or he has left journalism. Right now, he's into tech. He's doing something else entirely. Now, he published this video to say something else, but as he was talking about that, he also mentioned the fact that he had left journalism. For somebody who contributed to the discussion towards electing the Nigerian president, towards choosing one person out of 200 million people, Hundeyin was actually a household name. He was an independent investigative journalist who, what are so many things, and that announcement was quite very instructive. But alongside that, he also made a lot of other important statement in that video. The video is 40 minutes. What I did was I summarized the video, removed clip up sections of it, and kind of hastened the video a little bit. And so the whole 40 minutes, you can actually see it in this 6-minute video watch.
A few days ago, I posted a tweet where I analyzed several reasons why, in my opinion, the U.S. military should not under any circumstances be allowed to open a military base in Nigeria. Apart from the fact that U.S. military bases historically, wherever they've opened in Africa, have not served any security purpose to the locals there, have not made the locals in any safer. In fact, in the case of Niger, the U.S. military base that opened there in 2012 only saw an escalation of what we now know as Boko Haram. And the VOA decided to do a fact check on this tweet. And the fact check was titled, Nigerian Journalist Misleads Millions of People on X, that is Twitter. If the VOA exists to project and promote American interests in that way, because whether you like it or not, the VOA is a US government mouth. That's all it is and will ever be. Where is the equivalent for a country like Nigeria? So when I ask that, where is the equivalent infrastructure for projecting Nigeria's interests, information infrastructure? You can't tell me something like NDA or Radio Nigeria, the Voice of Nigeria, because those things are government institutions which have been captured. Where does it happen? Anywhere on the world, anywhere on the planet, that 200 million people, allegedly 200 million people, exist in a country and have no capacity whatsoever to communicate what is in their interest or what they consider to be their group or national interest. Where does it happen? In Nigeria, a journalist is taught that your job is to shrink yourself, make yourself small and invisible, and basically just push out product, push out content, right? You are not meant to be notable in any way. You're not meant to have positions and opinions and anything. You're meant to be small and invisible and bland. You're supposed to be is this meek person who kind of does a simulacrum of holding power accountable but doesn't actually hold it accountable. The robust process of holding power accountable. Now that is taught to their own journalists where they come from, right? That is taught to their journalists. But that's not what they bring to Africa when they come here. What they bring to us is basically a souped up public relations, and they teach that to us as journalism. And then we wonder why most Nigerian journalists are not actually doing what many of us would consider to be world-changing work. Most Nigerian journalists are basically just establishment people who don't rock the boat. What stories have been opinion on it. If it's stories about, say, corruption or whatnot, you'll find that it's stories that go maybe 1 or 2 inches beneath the surface. Very sort of polite, surface level stories that don't really ruffle any feather. So stories like, oh, this thing was in the budget and the politician in charge did not actually deliver. This contract was awarded to one shady company that was incorporated 2 days ago. Like corruption scandals of the kind that, well, it causes a bit of a sensation for 5 minutes and everybody forgets about it because, frankly speaking, who cares? But the kind of stuff that could potentially, for example, bring down a government, that's not what these guys were ever for. And this was exactly the thinking I had in my head when I set out to set up West Africa Weekly 3 years ago. And, in its first iteration as a Substack newsletter, which it was at the time, I thought to myself that this would be the perfect vehicle to give Nigerians the opportunity to create their own independent platform telling these stories from their perspective for their own benefit. And what I mean by create is basically fund such a platform, because the funding is the issue. I should specify that there's a difference between funding journalism and funding media. They're not the same thing. Media is profitable. Journalism is not, right? Journalism is a social good. It's not profitable. It's never profitable. In my case, it was whatever little audience I had and whatever little subscription revenue I had that kept me going. And I followed this thing as far as I could until eventually I got burnt out. And I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to take a sabbatical from investigative journalism. I need to recharge. I want to do some other things for a while. I've never set out to be a hero. There are 200 million people in Nigeria, so it can't be up to one person to carry 200 million people on his back, right? And I basically stepped away. The last thing I did before I stepped away was I wrote this book, which was like my magnum opus, like my tell-all, and I stepped away, right? And the reason I'm saying this is not because I'm saying, people should have sympathy for me or I'm looking for anyone's pity or anything, because when I set out, I was aware of what this landscape looked like, and I suspected that something like that would happen, right? Nobody forced me to do this. What I am saying is just for the benefit of any Nigerians coming after me who seem to understand what is really going on in the world and who seem to understand how dangerous a place the world is becoming now and how important it is to be able to project your own narrative in a world where everybody is trying to force their narratives onto you. That whether it's David Hundeyin or it's not David Hundeyin, whoever it is, Nigerians need, as a matter of urgency, to find a way to fund their own journalism and do so in a way that removes the need for that external validation from your VOA or your BBC or whoever, because those guys should not get to determine what is or is not good journalism for you, because the existential context those guys come from and the governments that fund them have different priorities to you, have different goals to you, have different aspirations and perspectives to you, right? So again, whether Nigerians choose to fund independent journalism or they don't, at this point, I think we're well beyond asking anybody to do what they should or should not do. I personally have stepped away, as many of you may know. I have a comfortable 9-to-5 job tech now. I'm recording this video after work. As many of you may be aware, the world is going to war. I don't know when it's going to happen. Nobody knows exactly when it's going to happen, but the world is going to war, right? It's unmistakable. All the signs are there. This is the early 20th century repeating itself. The world is definitely going to war at some point. Many of the billionaires have started, many of you have heard, have been building bunkers in New Zealand. And in that coming war, it's going to be a war which is information first and digital first. That's the world that we're going into. So if you're going into that world and you don't have any means of projecting your own viewpoints, your own perspectives, your own existence onto the world, and you're waiting for one foreign CSO or one BBC or one Bloomberg or one Reuters or one CNN or one Voice of America to speak for you, I'm sorry. That's not going to end well for all of us, myself included.
Now, the first thing that will jump at you from that video was David Hundeyin's allegation that the American government want to plant a military base in Nigeria. I do not know how true this allegation is, but it appears that it is kind of concrete. Okay, Hundeyin didn't break the story. Some other person did. Hundeyin only opposed it with his own points and so on. And then the Voice of America took up his tweets, and then they responded to it with an article. So that's what he was, talking about in that video. You can watch the full video. The link will be in the description, okay, for us to be able to see. All right. And Hundeyin is saying basically this. This is the summary of his argument, that if whoever pays the piper will dictate the tune. If the international body, international organizations continue to pay and fund media in Nigeria, they're going to also dictate to us what we're going to have to hear or what we need to hear, and that's the whole thing. That's the whole idea behind it. Whoever pays the piper will dictate the tune. That's the way it is, And as Hundeyin was talking, the whole discussion came home to me. All right. I could very easily replace journalists in Hundeyin's discussion or in his monologue. I could replace journalists with Christian ministers and then also replace journalism with ministry. When Hundeyin was making the point that journalism does not make money, and that is a social good, he was very right. It's just in the same sense where that ministry also does not make any money. It's a social good. And if there's going to be a thriving ministry anywhere, some good-hearted person or some good-hearted organization or some church somewhere is going to have to sponsor ministry. They are going to have to pay the bills of the minister. The only problem, of course, now is that we are getting to the point where, just like it is in the field of journalism, that ministry is also being funded by international bodies in Nigeria, okay? And in the process of doing that, they also are dictating the tune for what we say, okay? So if you are a minister, you are preaching something, you are preaching the gospel, the moment you say something that the person who is funding you does not like, they withdraw their funding. That's the problem, okay? Now, our brothers and sisters in the charismatic movement who have succeeded in hoodwinking people through tithes and offering don't have that problem because they have succeeded in on raising funds on their own. The people who have the problem are the people in the Reformed tradition. Those of us who are in Reformed ministries, okay? We must preach and teach almost the things that our foreign funders will dictate to us. So that's it. You can actually almost replace the journalist with the Christian minister and replace journalism with Christian ministry in Nigeria, okay, or Reformed ministry in Nigeria. Okay. Now, when I was in seminary, there was something that our teachers taught us when we're looking at ecclesiology, the study of the church. The minister made us, the teacher there, he helped us to understand that there's something that missionaries must do when they get to the field of missions. They must contextualize the gospel. This is what they mean. They say something like this, that when you bring the gospel to people in a setting, you are not going to change the gospel, but you must bring it to a context in which the people will understand it. If you're going to be translating the Bible into their language, there are going to be terms in the Bible that you cannot find words for. You will have to use words in their language for those things. Okay, and so on. Contextualization also means that you may have to not sing European hymns in the context and change those European hymns to local hymns, word for word, things like that. You may have to jettison your suits and your shoes for local wears and not even wearing shoes at all. So many things like that. So contextualization is a big deal. Okay. And usually what happens, of course, is that because the gospel is usually or mostly Western, or most of the gospel we are taught is Western or European. When we go to these places, when they come to Africa, they also give us European culture. Okay. And sometimes we cannot differentiate between what is gospel and what is European. Okay. Sometimes we combine it so that eventually a minister is not preaching until he's wearing a suit, okay? Or marriage is not marriage until it is conducted in church, not realizing that marriage can be local. That's something else entirely, okay? But contextualization is a big deal, okay? And also, Christian ministry has a context in which it must be brought. Now, if at the close of the day, the people funding you cannot understand the context in which you are preaching, cannot understand the nuances, the peculiar forces that you are fighting against, in fact, the demonic forces that you come face to face with as a minister, and you end up doing certain things, the people who are funding you will think that you have, lost your way, and they withdraw funding. That's the problem. Okay, so just as David Hundeyin is saying that journalism must get to the point where it becomes locally funded, if we're going to have successful Christian ministries or successful Reformed Christian ministries, it also has to be locally funded. We must find people who believe in the message enough. We must find such people who will prosper enough in the work of their hands and be able to put money down so that social good of Christian ministry is done. Okay, so that thing is so very, very important. We must get funding right. And what is also abundantly clear is that Christian ministers can't live on 50,000 naira per month anymore. They can't live on 100,000, even 200,000 is small per month. Okay, they have to be well paid. They have to be very, very well paid. So that means that the gospel has to get out to people who will make enough money, who will be able to pay their ministers. All right, and in my book Humanity, I talked about who will pastor our children. I mean, those who will pastor our children. And in that article, I was making the argument that if all of our children go to the university, they learn to become doctors, engineers, lawyers, and so on, and none of them is going into the ministry, what is going to eventually happen is this: all the eggheads, all the smart professionals will come to church and they will not have any pastor. They won't. So now, the only way they're going to have a pastor is for that pastor who feels called to ministry, go to seminary, get trained, and then come to a local church. And the doctors, the engineers, and the lawyers, and so on, they bring resources together and they pay him. Not pay him peanuts. Pay him well. The same kind of salary they earn in their organizations, they pay him even more, so that he commits himself to doing the ministry. And that's the idea behind Malachi 3, 8 to 12. When God was saying, bring the tithes and offering to my home. So that these Levites don't have to leave the work of ministry and go to the farm. Okay? Now, while we may not be preaching tithes and offering today, we must preach consistent, cheerful, and generous giving in church. All right? If not, there will be no funding. And if there's no funding, there's no ministry. And if there's no ministry, the devil will take over our lives. It's a no-brainer. Our children will not be taught. Our wives will not be taught how to be submissive to their husbands, and the devil will take over. All right. So just as it is an issue in journalism, it is also an issue in Christian ministry. We thank God for the ministries, international bodies who are sponsoring ministries in Nigeria. But the truth of the matter is that if we're going to do it right at all, ministry has to become locally funded. Okay, so that's the first point I wanted to raise. The second point I want to raise, and just 2 points. Second point I want to raise is this issue of the world going to war. And it was what struck me the most in what he said. He didn't spend too much time talking about it, but the reason why it struck me was because in the past few weeks, I have not been able, in fact months, I've not been able to get over the thought that war is coming to our world. Now, I could be wrong, and it is totally subjective. I'm not saying it's a prophetic anything. I'm not saying God told me anything. But I have not been able to get over the thoughts that our world is going to war. And I'll explain why. First of all, there's the biblical scripture, Jesus, who says that there will be wars. Matthew 24, Jesus said there will be wars. In the end time, there will be wars. That's the first thing. Secondly, I've checked the history of Europe. I listen to a lot of people, watch a lot of people's profile, and I see wars after wars after war. Throughout the centuries, there have been wars after wars. In fact, Europe is divided in the manner that it is divided because of war. Conquering and conquerors. They are conquering lands, the maps of nations are changing. All right, so that is it. And in the 19th century, not even 19th century. Yes, in the 19th century, or even before the 19th century, first there was the American Revolution, where the American people revolted against British rule. And that was towards the end of the 18th century. And as that was happening, the Americans couldn't win the war. So what they did was they teamed up with the French. The French had always been enemies with the British. So the Americans invited the French to help them. And the French went with mercenaries, they went with funding, and they helped the Americans to defeat the British. And then America had independence. But as America was getting independence, the resources that France took to the continent or to America to fight those wars had dwindled so badly in France. And ideally, they shouldn't have even experienced it that much. But for some reason, a particular year, harvest was very bad. And so, because of that, there was no bread. And the people began to revolt. And before it, they overthrew their monarchy and they had the French Revolution. And then the French Revolution led on to a gentleman called Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte started his wars in the 1790s and he fought his wars into 1812, 1815 to the 1820s. All right. And he was defeating nations after nations after nations. The whole idea behind what Hitler did was the same thing Bonaparte did. The only thing I think was that Bonaparte did not kill Jews. Okay. He just went nation against nations and the best nation won. And Napoleon, in fact, if you check the map of France till today, is quite large because of Napoleon's effort, they gained quite some land mass. All right. But eventually Napoleon was defeated and peace returned to Europe. But it was short-lived because different parts of the world continued to have crisis until we came to the first part of the 20th century when we had the First World War. Now, what you call the First World War had always been like a normal war in countries. I mean, in Europe. Europe has always had those kinds of wars. The only difference was that this time around, England was colonizing lots of parts of Africa. France was colonizing parts of Africa. And so they got mercenaries, so they got people from Africa to come and fight for them. And then they were also colonizing parts of Asia. And so eventually what was supposed to have been a European conflict became a world war. And that's why it's called a world war, the very first one. Okay. And that raged on from 1914 to 1918. And it stopped until, of course, Germany was defeated. And Hitler felt that Germany and his people felt that they had been cheated. And before you knew it, when they told them not to build a military, not to amass weapons, they decided to do that. And eventually we had the Second World War, which raged on from the 1930s until 1944, 1945. All right. And then something happened at what close to the Second World War was the nuclear bomb that America dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. And that shut everything down. Now, the invention of the nuclear war totally reinvented or changed ideas behind wars. Prior to this time, when two nations are fighting, there will be a bigger power behind them, or behind the two nations, that will also be that will be backing them up. Eventually, those two bigger powers will go to war until they find somebody who wins. Okay, but since the invention of the nuclear wars, of the nuclear weapon, that doesn't happen anymore. When two nations are fighting, big powers support them from behind the scene. They don't fight themselves anymore. The reason is because, God forbid, anybody throws a nuclear weapon today. We do not know what is going to happen. So that's what led to the crisis between the Koreas. North Korea, South Korea. South Korea was supported by America. North Korea supported by the communist Russia. Okay. Even in Nigeria, during the Nigerian Biafran Civil War, Britain was supporting Nigeria. France was supporting Biafra. So that was how it was. It had always been like that. Today, we are in the Ukraine war. While Russia is trying to fight Ukraine, the British and the Americans are supporting Ukraine. That it has always been something like the support had always been proxy, okay, by proxy. All right. The only question is, how long will proxy wars continue? We do not know, because eventually one madman is going to come out somewhere. It could be Putin. It could be in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who will drop the nuclear nuclear bomb, and before you know it. But whether we like it or not, our world is going to war. That's the first reason. The second thing is, the first one, it was Jesus's prophecy. Second one is looking at the chemistry of wars. Nations have always been at war. The third one is this, the prophecy of Joseph. Joseph talked to the king about 7 years of plenty, and then talked about 7 years of famine. Now, if you look at the time distance between 1945 and now, it's been some 70 years plus. We are almost exhausting our time of peace, time of prosperity. I sense very strongly that the world is going to war. Okay? And so what David Hundeyin is saying is very, very true. It's something that has been in my mind. But when he said it, the thing just clicked. Okay? Now the question is this. When we go to war, what are we going to do? Of course, we don't have all the weapons that the war powers have. But there's something else we can have that they have, and they are trying to deny us. And that's the power of information. It was during the Nigerian Civil War that we came to realize the powers of propaganda. Biafra did not have much, but they had their mouth. They had their radio. And that thing was informing the whole world and pitching the whole world against Nigeria. In fact, if that war had dragged on for another 4 or 5 years, the world would have recognized Biafra, and Biafra would have become an independent country, and Nigeria would have been commanded to leave Biafra. So everything Gowon was doing was to conquer Biafra as soon as possible. Everything he did was to conquer it, because Biafra was getting increasing sympathy, and those sympathies were coming through propaganda information. And that was 1966 to 1970, or 1967 to 1970s. That was the late 60s. Do you know the powers of information today? What information? What do we have? We have YouTube, we have Facebook, all that, or we have Twitter. Abi, okay. Now, all that these American powers are going to do is just a press of a button, and we are off the internet. Why? Because our social media is totally dependent upon their infrastructure. Everything we do is dependent on them. So my channel is on YouTube. The day it is removed, it's gone. Okay. So when Hundeyin was talking about the fact that Nigerians must begin to now own their journalism, he was saying something very, very sensible, because we can't continue in a state where it is foreign powers who will be telling our media houses what to broadcast. Because eventually, God forbid, when war comes to war and our people are dying en masse somewhere, and the foreign power say that 1 million people have died, just tell them that 10 people died. And then nobody can feel the urgency, and then you can't respond to the situation the way you ought to respond. Okay, it's going to be an information war, because it is by information, probably through Twitter, that you know that one country is sending rockets, and then you take refuge. All right, but if you don't have that information, what do you do? If they are the ones controlling the information you receive, what will you do? Okay, now what David Hundeyin has said is even of a higher emergency level at the spiritual level. Because while the world is not at war, in the spiritual realm, we are already at war. We are constantly at war. It's a spiritual war. The kingdom of darkness is seeking over and over to take over and silence the voice of the gospel. Are we not concerned about the fact that, our streets are filled with false churches, false pastors, false Christians, all kinds of nonsense going around in the name of Christianity? Nobody's concerned. You think this thing is Ojulasan? You think it's just going on like that? It is not. This thing is the work of the devil. We are at war. We are at spiritual war. The souls of men are being lost en masse. Okay, and the churches must be the one to recognize the need for the gospel to spread. And it is in peacetime that gospel messages spread, because at war, everybody will be running for their lives, running to save their heads. Okay, so this thing is actually very, very interchangeable. The journalist can be replaced with the pastor or the preacher or the minister or the evangelist. The journalism can be replaced with Christian ministry. We must become independent. We must get to the point where we become locally funded. In the past 6 months or 9 now, I've been working with Pastor Anier Khan Eko of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Rumadara, Port Harcourt. He ordained me to ministry last year, April. And in the process of working with him, I met a young man. In fact, very soon, I'm going to interview him on my channel. We're going to discuss. We're going to talk to him. His sound, reformed to the core. But people don't know him. Sound, brilliant young man. Works in an oil industry, making good money. And I was talking to him. I said, mister, with all this your sound mind, why are you not in Christian ministry? He said, I'm already in Christian ministry. He said that he works in, he was trained in a seminary, but that despite the fact that he works in a secular context, he still does ministry there, and that he believes that, as long as the ministry or the church does not have the kind of resources it should have, the gospel will not spread in Nigeria. And it's not about waiting for money to come from Britain or America, churches in Britain and America. It is the money we make here, because contextualized gospel preaching is what Nigeria needs. It's not what they come to tell us from Kenya or Zambia or Ghana and say, this is how we do reform, and then you hear that this is how you are doing reform now. But and then you begin to do it. No, it is living in Nigeria, seeing the peculiar needs of Nigerians and seeing how to bring the gospel to them. They will never understand it in America. They will never understand it in Britain. It is those of us who are here that will understand it. Okay? If you listen, if our brothers in Britain, they listen to how some of us castigate Oyedepo or Benny Hinn and so on, they'll be saying, you are being too harsh. You should be winsome. But they do not know the kind of harm these people are bringing. They are not living here. They don't know the need. Okay? So they may not see the need to sponsor such ministry. It is us, those of us who are wearing the shirt, we know where it pinch, that will know how to. So what am I saying here? I'm saying two things. Number one, what David Hundeyin is saying makes a lot of sense. And it is an emergency. An emergency. The Nigerians must, I am alarmed to hear that as brilliant as that young man is, he has left journalism. And I'm alarmed because after David Hundeyin, there's no other person. In Ibadan, we have Edmond Obilo. The young man is doing some powerful investigative journalism, changing the landscape. And this young man has had to stop it because of funding. Okay, and that can be translated to the spiritual realm also. Gospel preaching in Nigeria will not reach the height it will reach if we don't find local people sponsoring it. That's why when I began to hear that some Reformed churches are preaching tithe, I couldn't object to it. Personally, I couldn't. The reason is because, look, the churches need money and we cannot run away from it. If you are making money, please sponsor the church. Put money into gospel preaching. Let our ministers go into full-time ministry. Some of us can't do it because we don't have the sponsorship. So we have to do it part-time. Okay, but we must. This thing cannot be done part-time. It has to be done full-time. Amen. I trust that this message makes some sense and that we can run with it, but it's two ways. The journalists the airwaves of information of media is being taken over by either foreigners or those of them who are in Nigeria who are being paid by the state. So we're not hearing the truth anymore. And if you cannot hear the truth through journalism, you're in danger. You're in danger. And you know what happens when war comes? Let me explain to you. Some of us, I'm 47, some of us are already living the level of war. Okay, so when they come to conscript people, I'm too old. Okay, so I have left that. The only place I could probably operate might be at officers level. But I'm too old to go and fight, carry gun and fight. The people that they will conscript are 16 to 30 year old, okay? And they are not going to go next door. It is you that is 16 and to 30 that they will conscript. So what happens? It means this, that the political temperature of every nation is something that all of us must be concerned with. The decisions that our countries are making, we should be concerned with it. Now, if America is talking about planting a military base in Nigeria, and they have done it in Niger, and Niger expelled them recently, and while they were in Niger, they didn't add a single kobo to the peace of Niger. Instead, while they were there, Boko Haram came forth and ravaged all of that area, and they were looking. When they were in Liberia, what did they do to stop the violence in Liberia during the Liberian War? When they were even in Rwanda, what did they do? They usually would just protect their own and leave the rest of you to kill yourselves. Okay, so if they are in Nigeria, what exactly are they going to be doing for Nigerians? Okay, and God forbid they are coming here now invites. The Yorubas will say something like, it's the smelly person that the fleas come, they follow. If their presence here now eventually invites the wrong set of people, what do we do? Okay? If war breaks out, it's the young people that will fight it. You and I, it's men that will fight it. In fact, that is when these stupid countries will realize that there's a difference between man and woman. Because they will send a battalion of women and they will all be killed in one sweep. Then they will realize that there is a difference between a man and a woman. But that's by the way. What I am trying to emphasize is this. David Hundeyin has left journalism because Nigerians were not sponsoring him. And I'm culpable because I remember one time when he did a video and he ended by appealing for sponsorship. And I was just looking because I didn't have the money. Okay? But those of you who have, please put money into things like private journalism, private investigation. People like Fisayo Soyombo, Edmond Obilo, David, bring this young man back. Bring Hundeyin back. Okay, and that's on journalist level. And those of us who are in ministry, serving the Lord Jesus Christ, who have proven records, we have proper oversight over us. Put money into our work, okay? Give us money. Let's serve Jesus Christ. And you will be better off for it. My name is Deji Yesufu. I pastor Providence Reformed Baptist Church. I pray that this video blesses you. Please share it with your neighbor. Thank you for listening.